Hello and welcome to Face to Face. Our guest today is someone we've interviewed before, Joshua Blakeney. We're going to be talking about a lot of different things, but we're going to start with something that Joshua is involved in organizing, and that's the upcoming 9/11 hearings. Joshua, maybe you can tell us when they are and then everything about it.
Yeah, so thanks for having me back, Jack. It's great to be with you. On June 15th to 17th at the Denman Theatre in Vancouver, there'll be a series of lectures and presentations offered by experts in the field of 9/11 studies, this kind of nascent academic field that's emerged since the events of 9/11, where many scholars have kind of dropped their other research and looked into 9/11, realizing it's a very important event. And so we'll be having the Vancouver hearings to address that in a kind of a quasi-judicial way. Obviously, many will know that last September, on the 10th anniversary in Toronto, there was the Toronto hearings, where academicians and specialists who've addressed 9/11 came together in an attempt to do such a quasi-judicial hearing into 9/11. And I attended those hearings and came away with a little bit of skepticism, a little bit of discontent, although I thought much of it was very pleasing. And so I talked to a colleague of mine, Professor James Fetzer, who is a philosopher of science at from University of Minnesota Duluth, emeritus now. He's an amazing scholar, pumps out articles and essays almost on a weekly basis, appears on Press TV regularly. And so he and I talked together about, what perhaps were the omissions of the Toronto hearings and how we might remedy that, because many people in the 9/11 truth movement, for example, are interested in the Pentagon incident. You and I discussed that on a previous show, but that was largely omitted from the Toronto hearings. There was many things that I felt could have been done a little bit better, and so our attempt is to try and have our go at it by respecting really the organisers of those hearings. I spoke to the organisers of those hearings about it, and they often said, well, if you want to do your conference, then organise it yourself, and that's what I'm attempting to do in the Vancouver
So
hearings.
I'd like to say that probably most people who are listening to us have heard very little or nothing about the Toronto hearings.
Yes.
Because the media, of course, that's something that the media just will not talk about. They will not talk about the truth of 9/11. And the truth of 9/11 are the many, many questions that show that the official story of 9/11 is basically impossible. Or at the very least, there has got to be an honest, at least quasi-judicial inquiry or hearing about, because as they often say, 9/11 did change the world in many ways, and including a new border deal has been signed or not. No, it's hard to know if anything was actually signed, but it's happening anyways, to put one border around Canada and the United States based on the security threats and terror threats that we have because of 9/11. But 9/11 is the official story, I believe, is a pack of lies. So maybe you can tell people what is going to be happening in Vancouver that is of tremendous importance, I think.
Well, of course, underlying it or underpinning the Vancouver hearings and the 9/11 truth movement is the idea that the threat from terrorism is a farce. I mentioned last time I was on your show that you're more likely to die from lightning or in the bath based on US statistics than die from terrorism. Therefore, why are we not having a war on bathtubs rather than why are we having a war on terrorism? So based on that illusion that emerged, that was induced by 9/11, which appears to have been a false flag attack, it's really unprecedented. Many people throughout North America have mobilized in order to draw attention to the fallacies with the official story of 9/11. Working class people invariably going to their shopping malls with DVDs and disseminating them to people. It's kind of an unprecedented matter. And so I think that those academics who have dealt with 9/11 ought to come together from time to time in order to present their evidence. And I think there's kind of two divergent schools of thought in the truth movement. One is, I think this is what was the premise of the Toronto hearings, which is if we do kind of like public relations, if we kind of present ourselves in a respectable and dignified way, then that we can appeal to the government who might, one day investigate the events of 9/11, or the media who might report on 9/11. And that had limited success at the Toronto hearings. I remember there was a lot of praise for the National Post, who actually kind of favorably reported on the Toronto hearings. They actually it wasn't a complete hit job.
I don't agree with that way of going at things, that, that you hope that the government or the media will pick up on it. But I think it's wonderful that people do. I think we have to be coming at this from many, many different angles. What's the angle that the Vancouver hearings are going to take?
Well, as I say, so there's this school of thought that is kind of premised on we have to act in a very presentable way. One of the tenets of the Toronto hearings was we should use the least controversial evidence, which Professor Fetzer and I have kind of challenged, because, controversial evidence can be more compelling and more relevant, and uncontroversial evidence can be kind of trivial. And some of the presentations at the Toronto hearings, for example, there's a psychologist named Laurie Manuel who kind of addressed kind of a psychological aspects of the war on terror. And Professor Fetzer and I kind of concluded that was slightly trivial and that there was kind of more relevant things to bring up. And so the premise of the Vancouver hearings is that the government's never going to investigate. That's like a surgeon operating on his own foot. It's never going to happen. The media is never going to actually address the most compelling pieces of evidence. They may, play lip service to the fact that an event took place, but they're not really going to address the more controversial aspects.
Let me interject, because I think this is a very important question. Why isn't our government going to look into it, especially when they've sent us to war over it? And why won't the media look at it?
Well, because they're the people who cheerleaded these wars of aggression. They're the people who sold us these wars of aggression, demonized anyone who looked into the events of 9/11 as conspiracy theorists, even though, a conspiracy is nothing to be ashamed of. I mean, every criminal lawyer or judge every day is proffering conspiracy theories. A conspiracy is two or more people coming together to plan an illegal act. So the official story is ipso facto a conspiracy theory too. And so obviously, your question is a very interesting one. Why is it that the government is so not only intent on, demonizing those who are looking into 9/11, not dealing with 9/11 at all? I mean, 24 Canadians perished on 9/11, and yet the government didn't investigate. Can you imagine if 24 Canadians died in Burma or India or New Zealand? We'd investigate, but yeah, when they died...
And we've been at war literally almost ever since in Afghanistan.
Yes.
Fighting a war that is sold to us by both the governments and the corporate media as a war for democracy and to help women and to help children. And a lot of Canadians believe that. And I wish they were right. But personally, I don't believe that that's why we're there at all, which is not a slur against the Canadian soldiers there. I mean, the slur is that they're being killed in a war. What's it for? Oil, gas, political power, money, wealth, corporate power?
All of the above, I think.
Yes.
And I mean, that's a shame. And I think that's the thing is I feel like with 9/11 skepticism, we're kind of respecting those who died on 9/11 and we're respecting the troops, right? Because we're saying if it is the case that they went to war on a pack of lies, there has to be some reckoning. There has to be some people being held accountable. And I think with the Vancouver hearings, it's basically we're trying to do the comprehensive citizens investigation into 9/11. Premised on the notion that the government's never going to investigate itself, the Canadian government's never going to go to New York and try and dig through all the evidence. And so that's really what we're trying to address with the Vancouver hearings. Of course, there's a lot of internal politics to the 9/11 Truth Movement. We try our best not to become a cult and too incestuous, but there's stuff over the nanothermite issue. I know you've had Niels Harrit on your show, but there's some challenges to his scholarship. There's a NASA scientist called Mark Hightower who did a paper on this and worked with Professor Jim Fetzer, who I'm organizing the conference with, who actually drew attention to the fact that nanothermites only ever demonstrated a detonation velocity of 895 meters per second, whereas to shatter steel and shatter concrete, you need like 3,200 meters per second detonation velocity for concrete and 6,100 meters per second detonation velocity for steel. And therefore, Professor Fetzer and Mark Hightower have challenged the nanothermite paper and concluded that maybe it's either a red herring or leading us to in gray areas,
But all of them, I believe, agree that the official story of 9/11 cannot be possible.
Yes, and I think what's happened is that in the first few years after 9/11, it was okay just to go into that, and for academics to say, I'm just going to say the official story is false and stop there. We don't have an obligation to come up with a counter hypothesis. But we're a decade past 9/11 now, and it's about time, I think, that we do come up with the answers of not just what happened on 9/11, but how and why. And I actually had time with Richard Gage, who heads architects and engineers for 9/11 Truth recently, and I was kind of pushing him a bit and saying, you don't talk about this, you don't talk about, for example, the Israeli implications on 9/11. There was Israelis arrested on 9/11 in New York City. Many people think Israel was involved in 9/11. You don't talk about the fact that it's been demonstrated that actually the hijackers, it's not been proven they even boarded the planes on 9/11. There's a meticulous scholar called Elias Davidson, who's from Iceland but lives in Germany, who's demonstrated that the government's never actually made the case that any hijackers boarded the planes on 9/11.
Let's just take that for a second. I mean, think of that. I mean, everything about the official story is open to question if you just look below the surface. And yet all of the corporate media in this country will never ask one question and completely and totally ignore the issue, which I'm sure they'll do with the Vancouver hearings when they take place. And they did with the Toronto hearings, at least out here. We didn't really get any information. I mean, that's what we're up against.
And like you said, the Afghan war, I mean, it's basically premised on the idea that we have crazy Muslims to go and catch. But if the hijackers weren't Islamists, and there's a lot of evidence, they were seen drinking vodka, going to strip clubs. One of them was dating a prostitute, all these kinds of things.
Many of them are still alive, it seems?
Yeah, up to 10 of them were found alive, including the BBC reporting that, in the aftermath of 9/11, that they turned up alive. So, how, asking basic questions. So how could hijackers that allegedly perished in suicide attacks still be alive?
Yeah.
How can these Islamists who want to die for the Quran, and we've gone to war to extirpate this Mephistopheles, these Islamists from the Tora Bora and from the Middle East, how could it be that they're in fact seen engaging in un-Islamic activity?
Let's go over what you might consider the 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 most important issues. Like, to me, it's why did the U.S. Air Force sit on the ground during the attack and do nothing?
Yeah.
Building 7, obviously a controlled demolition. The fact that there seems to be no proof at all of an airplane at the Pentagon. I mean, they've never shown any proof. The fact that on the FBI most wanted list, there was never any evidence presented that Osama bin Laden was in any way involved. They simply never accused him of involvement in 9/11. All of that,
And bin Laden actually denied involvement in 9/11 in the immediate aftermath. There's a CNN article online you can still find, in something like September 14th or something, 2001. And he's quoted as saying, as a Muslim, I wouldn't have done this, I denounce this, and the US keeps blaming me every time there's an explosion. They keep saying it's me, and I've got nothing to do with this. Personally, I got into 9/11 with a background in the Palestine solidarity movement, and so everyone has their own slant when they get into 9/11 studies. For me, I think the evidence of Israeli involvement in 9/11 is compelling. Obviously, Larry Silverstein, he's someone very aligned with the Israeli government. Haaretz reported he has a weekly phone call with the Israeli Prime Minister, Benjamin Netanyahu. He has investments throughout the occupied territories. And so I personally, and there's obviously Israelis were arrested on 9/11. In fact, there's evidence that there was some Israelis trying to blow up the George Washington Bridge on 9/11. There's all kinds of, one Israeli company ran all the airport securities on 9/11, as was the case with the Panty bomber in Holland, and often whenever these incidents happen, there seems to be Israeli involvement. And so from my perspective, and I battle with those in the pro-Palestinian movement over this, because they're often bringing people to come and talk about Palestinian rights, the Palestinians who live in Israel was the latest one. We were discussing, they wanted to bring a speaker from Britain to discuss the Palestinian rights or lack thereof in Israel. And I was saying, well, like most Canadians, when they're going to hear the Israeli propaganda saying Palestinians have more rights in Israel than the rest of the Arab world and blah, 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 I said, why don't you invite, for example, James Petrus, right? He's done a lot of work on the Israel lobby, on, identifying perhaps possible motives for the war on terror and so on. I said, why don't you bring him in? He talks about the Israelis that were arrested on 9/11. I said, if you want North Americans to empathize with the Palestinians who are victims of Israeli terrorism, why not show them that on 9/11, they were victims of Israeli terrorism, which I think is the case. That's what I've deduced from my 9/11 studies.
Now, because here's, I think, one area where we disagree. I would not be surprised if Mossad was involved, just as the CIA was involved, MI6 was involved. Clearly, the corporate-owned media must be involved because their job was to make sure that no questions were ever asked after the event.
Yeah.
So yes, but are you saying that Israel was the motivating force behind the attack on 9/11?
Yeah, I believe so. And
okay, so there I completely disagree with you.
Yeah, because I think
a player like many other players, yes.
Well, I think I try to avoid generalizations, and I think the best way to deconstruct the US is it's very complex. Ilan Pappé, who's an Israeli historian, you probably know of him. He's a dissident Israeli scholar who lives in University of Exeter. Where he's a professor now. He's referred to clusters of power in the United States. We use the corporate this or that, or the CIA, the Mossad, but in reality it's all factionalized, and increasingly it's private companies, And so, I come to the conclusion, I looked at the scholarship, for example, of Professors Walton Mearsheimer of the University of Chicago and Harvard, James Petrus, he worked for required reading when I was an undergraduate, Kevin Barrett, who's a Fulbright scholar, Stephen Snigoski, he wrote an amazing book called The Transparent Cabal, right, in which he went into, the neocons, their kind of genesis, and they did come to the conclusion that actually the war on terror was not a continuation of American empire, was not just, it kind of became fashionable after 9/11 just to refer, it's the permanent war economy, it's just an extension of what happened in the Cold War. But if you actually look at US Middle East policy in the Cold War, they didn't actually do that many invasions, their policy was to prop up leaders, like Arab strongmen, in order to foment stability in the Middle East and encourage stability, because they want to despoil the oil resources, right? But if you look at the war on terror, that policy is largely a divergence from that. It's actually deviated from that policy of propping up Arab leaders and to defenestrating them and ousting them, taking them out in order to balkanize the Middle East and create civil war. And so obviously, in the neocons, you had people who I would say weren't American empire builders, but were Israeli empire builders, like Richard Pearl, Feith, Wolfowitz, Scooter Libby. These people, in my view, have spent their whole careers trying to align US policy with Israeli policy. And I think the neocons actually genuinely believed that the US's national interests were aligned with those of Israel. But I think there's been a challenge to that in the scholarship, and I've actually read that scholarship and I've agreed with those conclusions. Then you get into 9/11, because all of these scholars agree that without 9/11, this agenda, which many have called the Sharon Doctrine. Ariel Sharon was the Israeli prime minister, very militant.
And again, I would disagree with you. I see it more from a corporate point of view. And the world's corporations, which is where the real power lies, and I'm sure a lot of people you read would agree that the corporations do have a lot of power. They have their interests at play here, and it's their game that's being put forward by 9/11. And it seems like when something like that happens, and 9/11 is so big, but it's almost win-win-win for the other side. It happens and everybody makes hay out of it as best they can, and everybody else pays the price, especially the people of Iraq and now the entire Middle East. And the people of Canada, too. We are also paying a price.
Well, I think when you deal with a crime, though, you have to get down to like the nitty-gritty of who were the individuals who planned this. Who were the individuals
who planned it, yeah.
Yeah, and I think that there's a bandwagon created by 9/11, and there's elites, opportunists in the elite who jumped on that bandwagon. So I am completely in concurrence with you that there are corporations, there are war profiteers, there are people in the CIA who all jumped on the bandwagon. I'm really trying to get into who did 9/11, who really had a motive of demonizing Arabs and Muslims to such an extent. And I think there was...
And the power to make it happen.
Well, I think that, you have to, obviously that's why we need to get into what happened on 9/11 often, what were the technologies that were used to bring down the towers? There's dispute over that. How were they, planted, the explosives or whatever was used to bring down the towers? That's where Professor Fetzer has incurred some controversy, because he's he's come up with different hypotheses, which are very interesting, that we're actually going to talk about at the Vancouver hearings. And so...
Let's move on to Syria then. I haven't been following Syria much. I mean, what I know about Syria is or what I believe about Syria is that it's simply the next step in whatever the master plan is. I believe that there were Western special forces operating in Syria months ago, that they're obviously trying to bring down the Syrian government. What we're being told in the media, I think you absolutely cannot believe. I mean, some of it may be true, but the main message, I think, is you just can't believe anything you're being told. So at least here we have, with Joshua, a different point of view. So...
Well, as I told you, we're going to have to agree to disagree on the geopolitics of this, because I came to the conclusion in my studies, having read actually some of the Israeli scholarship, that the Israelis really are intent on balkanizing the Middle East. In fact, there's a great paper which you can Google called A Strategy for Israel in the 1980s, written by an Israeli geopolitical thinker called Oded Yinon. And he reflects upon what the Ottoman Empire did. They employed the millet system, which was breaking down the Middle East into kind of ethno-religious statelets or kind of Bantustans, kind of like the Indian reservation system, in order to rule them. And if we accept that Israel is kind of a rising power, a rising empire, it's beginning to kind of...
I don't accept that, because to me Israel is, it's a country of what, 5 million people?
Well, it's 6 million people, but it's got a very powerful... Professor Petrus is a leftist, a socialist like myself, and he's identified what he calls the Zionist power configuration in the United States, because Israel, it has a lobby, but then it has kind of more than that. To call it a lobby is not sufficient. In the US, you have a great number of people who are, successful people, professors, some bankers, some, doctors, professional people who are very radicalized, legitimately perhaps because of what happened in World War II, that they're very bitter, that they want to defend Israel in order to provide a safe haven, which I think I can see why people like Wolfowitz...
And I can see that Israel might have an interest in balkanizing the Middle East, just as any country might be doing, a lot of terrible things.
But I think that...
I just don't... to me, I see the power as being elsewhere.
Yes.
And Israel is, if you want somebody assassinated in Syria, maybe the Mossad is the best for doing it. But to run the world.
No. I think that's a straw man argument, Jack. I think that's a straw man. No one's saying, obviously there's a history of anti-Semitism. That's the context that we have to discuss this in. There are theories that have been projected in history that Jews run the world and Jewish bankers, control the media and all that. But I'm talking in terms of imperialism.
And so am I.
And I'm saying that, if on the left we denounced ethnic obscurantism in terms of the Afrikaners in South Africa or in terms of the Germans, actually the Israeli professor, Israel Shahak, who translated that paper I just cited by Oded Yinon, he compared exactly what Israel wants to do vis-a-vis the Middle East with what the Nazis wanted to do vis-a-vis Eastern Europe, go in, control it, kind of take over. And it's completely rational from an Israeli perspective to want that. And from the perspective of big oil and the oil companies in the United States, they don't want that. It's clear that if you actually look at the record, look at the Eisenhower Doctrine that was declared, just after World War II, it's obvious that oil companies want stability. That's why, for example, in the Suez Canal crisis, you saw France, Britain and Israel collaborating and the US actually coming in to police and create stability again. And I spoke to you before about how George Bush Sr. actually completely went against the interests of Israel. And so I think we've kind of been trained by, I'd say, people like some people on the left who are sympathetic to Israel to always view Israel as a tool of US imperialism. Israel's just it's an exploited, it's a tiny state. And that's kind of a paradigm that's been challenged now. And it's not challenged by me. I'm nobody compared to Walton Mearsheimer. They're like like international relations scholars who've dropped their other research to go into this. James Petrus, he's a leftist. He's very highly regarded in the academy.
I'm sure you can make the argument. And I just personally
and so when we get into Syria,
don't buy it. But I'm sure the argument can be made on both sides. I don't know. I'm not a scholar, furthest thing from it, so I don't know what they're saying. I just know what I think and believe after my life on this earth.
Yeah, and I think that my main attempt is to try and deconstruct the factions in the US empire. I'm not denying there's an American empire. I'm just saying that I think that the Middle East is being kind of outsourced to Israel now in some way. They're going to start policing the Middle East within the American empire. And this has happened throughout history, where you get local elites. When you look at Simon Bolivar in Latin America, his main complaint was, I don't like the peninsulares, the kind of people ensconced in Spain telling us, Creoles in Latin America how to rule Latin America. Likewise, I think Israel now doesn't like these kind of big oil companies propping up Arab leaders because those Arab leaders invariably turn on Israel, sponsor the Palestinian resistance. And I think there's that contradiction. So we get into Syria.
Okay.
And so I view Syria as an extension of that Israeli policy because Syria is highly fissiparous, has 18 ethnic groups, it's prone to factionalism. And President Bashar al-Assad is actually a Ba'athist, which is kind of the Arab socialism. And actually he does it a little bit more honestly than Saddam Hussein did, in Syria, the working class Syrian can buy a kilo of bread for 20 cents. The education's free, transport to school is free.
Why don't you go, because listen to this, folks, Syria and Libya before it, I believe were very, prosperous nations with, I don't know, because all I know is what I get in the media, but I think the populations were not on the verge of social revolution. What happened was an attack from the outside in both Libya and Syria. Am I right, do you think?
Yeah, you're completely right. You're completely right. And so whoever we identify as the people motivating this, there is clearly a plan to balkanize the Middle East. And I think what many left-wing people have unfortunately been kind of hoodwinked into doing is viewing Syria and Libya as an extension of the Arab Spring. So you look at like Hosni Mubarak in Egypt, the dictator of Egypt, who collaborated with the US and Israel in starving the Palestinians to death, for example.
For decades.
For decades. Well, he had like 5% support of the people. Syria is not the same as Egypt. Like President Bashar al-Assad is a reformer. He has a PhD from a British university. He's intelligent. And there's actually about 40% of the people hold him in high regard and really like him. There's a kind of middle ground in Syria that are against the kind of destabilization of Syria. And then there's a thin veil of kind of disgruntled middle class people who want to aspire to get into the higher echelons. The way that Syria is constructed with Ba'athist socialism is if you're like the working class, you're actually quite looked after. You can buy a kilo of bread, you can free education, your insurance is covered by the state.
Suddenly we see why Syria is being demonized, assuming this is true. And I think that's the most important point. We only get, I call it the corporate point of view, anybody else can call it whatever they want to call it, but we only get that point of view that tells us what it is they want to tell us. And they use that to manipulate us into supporting, now it seems like, one war after another that we're in.
I would say there's been an attempt, there's been an attempt to kind of stage protests in North America to support human rights in Syria and kind of co-opt the Arab Spring into, saying like, oh, what's happening in Syria? These civil human rights protesters in Syria are actually an extension of what happened in Egypt and Tunisia. But actually, if you look at the actual evidence coming out of Syria, and the best source I've seen is Webster Tarpley and Terry Messon went with a delegation to one of them to meet with one of the like Christian churches in Syria. So Syria has like 18 ethnic groups, many like Greco-Catholic churches, Alawites and Druze and Sunnis and Shias and all kinds of sects, right, that are kind of unified. And all those minority groups are definitely siding with the centralized government that kind of offers them protection, right? And so if you look at the actual like anecdotal evidence and reports coming out of Homs, for example, you have these ordinary Syrians who say, well, there was these kind of like black-clad snipers suddenly appearing on our roofs shooting at us. And in November 2011, Webster Tarpley and Terry Masson actually went into Homs, and they said that the protesters they came across were actually protesting to say we want the government to come in with their tanks to restore sovereignty and to fight these, black-clad, snipers, death squad. What happened in Latin America with the CIA in the Cold War. They
It's exactly what happened in Venezuela.
Exactly. Well, that's a perfect analogy, Jack. I really think the Venezuela, because, anyone on the left, right, if they saw what the imperialists were doing to try and splinter off, in Venezuela, they tried to siphon off the oil-rich province and pay a mayor to kind of secede. Anyone on the left would support Hugo Chavez using tanks to restore Venezuelan sovereignty and Venezuelan self-determination. But unfortunately, when it gets to the Middle East, I think that we've been encouraged to always view Arab leaders as bad, as demons, and in the case of President Assad, I think it's the case that an Arab strongman in this situation is not perfect, but it's better than the alternative that's being offered, because the alternative that's being offered is a kind of Rwanda type situation of, all these ethnic groups fighting each other and killing each other. And it's very easy to do through fourth flag terrorism, right? I mean, even in the beginning of the Egyptian revolution, people were missing. There was like bombs going off in the Coptic church, right? And this one document I cited earlier, that Israeli scholar was saying, well, we can do what we did in Lebanon, where we fragmented off, fermented sectarianism between the Christian phalangists and the other, groups in Lebanon. Many have referred to the current policy as the Lebanonization of the Middle East, encouraging Balkanization and sectarianism.
And I would completely agree that what's going on is, at the stage in human history where we are at, which is that we seem to be teetering on the edge in very many ways, environmentally, socially, and economically. This absolutely makes no sense. It's evil anyways to go in and try to do these kinds of things. But do you see, folks, how we are being manipulated by a media that lies to us about everything? Simply, please, you can't believe the media when they talk about things like Syria, when they talk about tax policy, when they talk about trade policy, because they're not interested in us. They don't work for us. They don't have our interests at heart. They're corporate owned. They represent different interests. And to me, what I see is that in Syria, when I see how we are being misinformed, then I say, well, why? Why are we being misinformed? In whose interest is it? And I think we all have to look at that and we have to rise up against what's happening, because we are getting into very late innings.
I think it could cost like millions of lives. Already, people say if Gaddafi had stayed in power in Libya, maybe 5,000 people or 10,000 people would have died. But in Libya, like 100,000 people have died, apparently, due to the internal sectarianism now. It's like a lot, and in Iraq, we know that, Gideon Polier of the Australian National University has deduced that 2.3 million people would have still be alive in Iraq extra if the Iraq invasion hadn't happened. So, in life, you have to, if you believe in human progress, and I know thanks to postmodern thought, something I really disdained in my university education was this kind of relativism, where there's a prevailing attitude in academia now where progress is kind of undesirable and unachievable, and that progress is a subjective thing. But I reject that. If you believe in the kind of coherent concept of human progress, you have to sometimes choose between bad or worse, right? Or the lesser of two evils. And I think that's what the average people in Syria are saying. They're saying that, they support President Assad's kind of gradualist approach to bringing Syrian democracy into fruition. They had an election recently and 51% of Syrians turned out and voted, which is comparable to Western countries, and all those Syrians that turned out and voted for the Assad program, I think they had like 7,000 candidates stood for election in Syria. They're rejecting the kind of UN proposal, really, the US and Israeli-backed idea of defenestrating and ousting the current incumbent Syrian government and trying to replace it through, regime change. They want to elect their own leaders. And I think there's a significant portion. I mean, I was interviewing Syrians in Calgary, right, in my capacity as a Press TV journalist. And it was quite astounding to meet Syrians who, they were declaring, we love President Assad. He's really popular in our country. And I've interviewed people, Middle Eastern scholars, who actually don't like President Assad. And they even that individual was Professor Mohammed Al-Masri. He said, yeah, about half of Syrians love President Assad. So in other words, he's more of a Hugo Chavez than he is a Hosni Mubarak, And I think that what's happening is people don't really understand the Middle East because it's complicated. And so it's very easy just to say, just to go out and say, oh, we support human rights in Syria. But we know that the big trick of the neocons was to do imperialism and to convince people it was done in the name of democratization and human rights. Imperialism was traditionally the imperialists said, we're going to Christianize the savages or civilize the savages. But the contemporary propaganda phrase is, democratization. Right? And so I think I would really encourage leftists to really look into this and not be fooled and bamboozled into supporting imperialism in the name of human rights, And I think that we also have to notice that ethnic parochialism can often lead to divisions, right? And I think it's well documented that throughout history, indigenous people have only ever overcome the wrath of imperialism if they unify and overcome their ethnic, identity politics. And I think that's what's great in Syria, that all the Syrians I meet are first and foremost Syrians. It was the same in Iraq. People say if you went to Iraq under Saddam Hussein, Iraqis were first and foremost Iraqis, right? But thanks to this Western policy, now Iraqis fragmented into Sunni, Shia, and Kurdish. And even now, the latest news is that the Western imperialists are trying to incite the Kurds in Syria to start, fomenting sectarianism again.
Divide and conquer
exactly.
is as old as the hills, and people are paying a very heavy price, and it's coming here. I mean, they're bringing it here. There's no question about that. There's a couple of other things you wanted to talk about, and you can. I'll mention three of them, or you can stay on Syria. But Press TV, the Huffington Post, and the NDP. You can go which one you prefer.
Well, the Huffington Post, I found myself being attacked yet again in the mainstream media. It seems to be something that keeps reoccurring when I get into the war on terror. And time again, I must say it's individuals who are the rest of the time authoring apologetics for the state of Israel. Jonathan Kay has written a book with a Mossad agent. He's the National Post editor. In the case of this individual, I had Fengelman's Folly. He decided to attack me this week to say that it's despicable that Press TV is functioning in Canada because Press TV is based in Tehran. One of his criticisms of me was that I had offered my condolences to the wife and baby of an assassinated Iranian professor. I felt like saying, well, what should I have done? Celebrated the fact that this Iranian professor was blown up in his car, obviously suspectedly done by the Israeli Mossad.
That's right. There's I just saw something, I think, on TV fairly recently that said a number of, I guess you're talking about Iranian scientists are being assassinated.
Well, I think what's happening is there's a new kind of Cold War, right, between US/Israel and Iran, right? And I think that the thing is, Iran is not a broken-backed and dilapidated country like Saddam Hussein's Iraq, so it's not going to be invaded. I don't think it's possible for the imperialists to invade Iran, because Iran has missiles that could rain down on London, on US bases in Japan. Like, Iran is not a dilapidated country. And so I think all they can do is, like what we saw in the Cold War, assassinations and kind of deep politics going on, like we saw between the Soviets and the US in the Cold War. And so I think that's what's going on. And so I was attacked by the Huffington Post. This guy works for Honest Reporting Canada, which exists, that entity exists to make sure there's honest reporting about Israel and Canada. So, he's all over YouTube talking about how the Canadian media is biased against Israel, which is kind of laughable to most people who would say that the Palestinians get short shrift by the Canadian media, disproportionately.
That is absolutely true. That is absolutely true.
And so anyway, so that's what he exists. So yet again, I'm getting attacked by someone, like in the case of Jonathan Kay, he's writing books with a Mossad agent. In the case of this individual, he's the head of this group, Honest Reporting Canada, that obviously wants to perpetuate an Israeli agenda in Canada.
He's critical of you because you're working for Press TV, but I'm sure nobody's heard of Press TV, so maybe you can tell us what it is.
Well, Press TV has offices in Washington, in London, in Tehran. So it's an English language service. It's kind of like the Iranian BBC, you might say. And increasingly, it's known as the voice of the voiceless because it illuminates the perspectives of people, Native Americans, Aboriginals in Australia, the people who are rising up in Bahrain, they're actually dealing with, the Syrian resistance, the people who are allying with their government to resist imperialism in Syria. And so I'm now submitting reports from Canada to Press TV in order to, address some of the issues that get ignored, of which there are so many in Canada. Of course, the robocalls scandal recently, the fact that Canadian democracy was suspended in the 2011 Canadian election, it would appear.
And it's been suspended ever since. I mean, if we allow them to steal that election, which at the moment seems to be exactly what's happened, then our democracy is finished, because once they've stolen one, they're not going to stop.
Well, exactly. And so I think this individual was taking issue with the fact that, obviously currently Iran is being demonized. It's kind of the man on death row. And I see myself as trying to, provide a more nuanced picture for Canadians. I'm not saying that we should ban Sun News, where I see Ezra Levant interviewing Mossad agents like almost every week on Sun News. It's explicitly has an agenda. And I think it's good for, if Canadians can have all the anti-President Assad propaganda they want, all the anti-Iran propaganda they want. But surely one guy in his camera, and is, trying to produce reports in Canada.
I think there's nothing more important than a variety of voices. And unfortunately, in Canada, we've got kind of maybe 1 1/4 voices. One is totally corporate, and maybe 1/4 is something a little less corporate, but still corporate. So, well, no, I shouldn't say that, because I think there is a lot of small independent media out there, but so you want to present to Canadians a picture of Iran and many other issues that's different than what we get in the corporate media.
I think sometimes we have to pinch ourselves and say, are they really saying we should bomb Iran, like a really important country in the world, very culturally rich, very important strategic country in the world? I mean, just to think that it's kind of scary that all there is really is Press TV trying to offer a kind of anti-war message on that, and obviously alternative media.
Now, Press TV is funded by Iran or the Iranian government or something like that?
To be honest, I don't really know how it's funded, and I personally think that's kind of an irrelevance because, say something...
No, I think you should be proud of it. I think we should be proud of it, that there's another voice coming in here.
I'm
nothing
very proud
more
of it.
important.
And of course, we have to remember, if you're a dissident who has a complaint against the Iranian government, you have the whole array of Western media at your disposal. I mean, if you actually want to criticize the Iranian government, you can go on Fox News, CNN, CBC, National Post, they'll welcome you on. And so I think that if there's one media venue trying to exonerate the Iranians and offer a more, address the specificities of what's going on in Iran, and then there's this whole slew of propaganda outlets demonizing Iran. I mean, this individual, Fengelman, he said, I was a shill for the Iranian government. Okay, suppose that's true for the sake of argument. I'm a shill of the Iranian government. Let's say that's true. So now Canada has one, maybe two. There's another chap in Ottawa who reports to Press TV. 2 shills of the Iranian government versus how many shills of the Israeli government or how many shills of the US government trying to...
and how many shills of the oil companies and how many shills of the banks and how many shills of the corporate world that,
Yeah, so surely, I mean, I think that, I like to think that the man on death row gets the best advocate, gets the best lawyer. And that's kind of my attitude, is that I want to, and to be honest, I'm not really just addressing Iranian specific issues. I mean, in Canada, it's kind of not really, I'm not really addressing Iranian matters. I'm addressing, the suppressed issue.
So where does Press TV exist? Like, how do people see Press TV?
Well, interestingly, it's been banned from Germany's satellite platform, and Britain recently said it's to be banned from their satellite platform. And so you can watch it on the internet, obviously. And if you go now to Press TV's website, they've got a big logo where you can click and see, if you're living in Britain, how to watch Press TV. But it's very interesting. In Canada, I don't think we even had the debate. I think it's just assumed it's not allowed in Canada on the satellite, because I actually saw Jonathan Kay in the National Post write a while back saying, I think Canadians are responsible enough now to have Al Jazeera on, because a lot of people think Al Jazeera has kind of sold out recently because of the way it's been portraying what's happening in the Middle East, and it's obviously affiliated with the Qatari dictatorship. And so, Jonathan Kay was saying, we should allow Al Jazeera on the satellite platform. But interestingly, in England, though, there's actually an individual who's suing the British government because they banned Press TV. And he did some polling around the different districts of London, and he was finding that 65%, 55%, 85% in different districts have said they watched Press TV. So I think really what's going on is it's becoming too popular, and I think it's being realized by those who are really trying to hoodwink us into supporting a war in Iran, support the destabilization destabilization of Syria. You know, the other day, Webster Tarpley and Jonathan Kay had a 9/11 related debate. And Jonathan Kay, obviously, he's written the book Among the Truthers, and he's tried to do these kind of psychoanalysis of the 9/11 truth movement. And every 5 minutes, Jonathan Kay was saying, oh, of course, the government doesn't kill you in North America, but if you're in Syria, President Assad does kill you, you know? So it's so obvious there's an agenda right now to demonize President Assad, who personifies the last bastion of Arab dignity in the Middle East, which is, of course, the Syrian people. And I really think it's important. That's why I've been addressing. I've done 2 reports to Press TV now. One was a 5-minute feature report, you know, interviewing Canadian Syrians who they have had elections in Canada. They've sent their votes over to Syria. They did like an exit poll, and they were saying like 2% of the people were against the President Assad. You know, were against the government's gradualist approach to Syrian democracy. And so, you know, it's really astounding when you see. And I think the problem is that a lot of the time people don't understand like the different nationalities within the Arabic-speaking world, you know, because even Syrians don't self-identify as Arabs actually. And so I think that it's a problem where people go to these protests and there's often like Salafists, like people from Pakistan, Lebanon, you know, who are supporting the kind of human rights in Syria, but really it's an imperialist agenda in Syria. And the actual Syrians who are from Syria living in Canada, they're spitting mad with the Canadian government. You know, John Baird is he's pledged like several $1 million to the, you know, to promote democracy in Syria. You know, and so these Syrians were saying,
please stop. Yes. Don't tell me that the Canadian government is pushing why don't they push some democracy in Canada?
Well, exactly. I mean, when I was driving here, Jack, you know, I was listening to reports about how we can't afford meat inspectors in Canada anymore. You know, part of the latest budget with the austerity imposed on Canada, our meat is not going to be inspected because the state doesn't want to pay meat inspectors. I heard a report about cleaners who have to go to other schools to borrow cleaning products to clean the schools, and yet we can afford to spend millions of taxpayer dollars, send them over to Syria to back up Salafist death squads. I mean, these Syrians who I was interviewing, it was almost a joke. You know, they were saying we're in Afghanistan. Canada's military in Afghanistan purportedly to fight Al Qaeda, but yet they're identifying those groups who are destabilizing Syria as Al Qaeda style forces, who are Salafist Islamists who oppose President Assad for obscurantist, ideological, and theocratic reasons. And they're often from Saudi Arabia or from Lebanon. They're not even from Syria. And we're told this is a so-called Syrian Free Army, or Friends of Syria is one of the entities that's being touted. You know that my Syrian friends call them the enemies of Syria because they say most Syrians are with the government's approach, which is they've now enshrined the constitution. 51% came out and voted. They're going to have presidential elections down the line. President Bashar al-Assad is highly intelligent. He's not he's not just a stooge, someone who's going along with the Western plan. He's actually, I mean, one thing Bashar al-Assad has been really exemplary on is the Israel-Palestine conflict, because of course in 1967, Israel stole the Golan Heights from Syria, right, when they did the Six-Day War, right? And so Bashar al-Assad has never...
That's 45 years ago, they still have them.
And yes, and he's refused to be obsequious and refused to kowtow to that agenda. And that's one reason he's despised. He stood in solidarity with the Palestinians. He sides with the Hezbollah in the south of Lebanon. And he's an ally of Iran. So I would say there's this kind of anti-imperialist bloc in the Middle East, represented by Hamas, Hezbollah, the Syrian government and Iran, that are actually not going along with the Western agenda and trying to express self-determination, of course, with all the imperfections that go along with that. But they're actually trying to forge their own path in the Middle East, and they're not going to go along with it. And it's interesting because President Assad is actually quite secular, you know. That's one reason he unifies a lot of people. He's not really that theocratic. And so there's this kind of alliance now of those who are standing up to Israel in the Middle East, which is the main hegemon in the Middle East now, and the US also, and they're opposing that. And interestingly, one example why I think this is jeopardizing the US's imperialist interests, apart from the statements that, you know, are coming from people like Zbigniew Brzezinski and the traditional US empire builders who are against the war in Iran now, actually, and it's only basically what I would say is Zionists in the United States promoting a war in Iran, because I don't see how it serves US oil interests. But even in Syria now, Suncor and all these oil companies are withdrawing, because as soon as you create civil war, it goes against the rational interests of an empire. I'm not for empire, but if we actually identify what's going on in the Middle East, all these oil companies are fleeing because they know if civil war continues to kick off in these countries, their investments in all the infrastructure and stuff is going to be spoiled.
One thing I noticed is that when the attack on Iran was heating up a few months ago, oil prices went up, and they've never come down. The price of oil has fallen significantly, and the oil companies are making, and so are a lot of others, making a fortune on this because of a tension that exists in the world, they tell us, only because we're told there's a tension. There doesn't have to be a tension.
Well, there doesn't have to be a
And I'm totally opposed to nuclear power. I don't want Iran to have nuclear power. I'm totally opposed to nuclear power everywhere. But for the United States and Israel to tell Iran that they shouldn't have nuclear weapons when they have thousands of them in the States and possibly 100 in Israel, how hypocritical can you possibly be?
And Iran could never use a nuclear weapon because Israel has, 800 nukes. So if Iran had one and never used it, it would ensure its national annihilation because Israel would just destroy that country. I mean, I believe it's like the US and Russia. Like the US could destroy Russia in 6 minutes and Russia could destroy the US in 6 minutes, right? Every major city in those countries. So you have mutually assured destruction. And I think, in fact, if Iran even now Iran has a pretty strong military, so that's why it can't really be attacked. It can only be, on the edges, attacked, or, they can destabilize these countries. And
well, I really hope things simmer down, and because we as a human race have got to start moving in a better direction. Can I ask you one question about a very famous quote that was attributed to the president of Iran, Mr. Ahmadinejad, in which he is quoted as saying, I don't know the exact words, but that Israel should be wiped out or removed from the map. But in fact, I've read many, many, many times that he never actually said that. It was a deliberate mistranslation that's been fed to us. Can you just say a few
he was
words
addressing
about
the
that?
ideological question of Zionism. So he quoted the Ayatollah Khomeini saying Zionism, like fascism and communism, would be wiped from the page of history. So if you wanted to wipe out communist Russia or communism from Russia, you didn't want to wipe out Russia and the Russian people. Likewise, if you want to de-Zionize Palestine and just say, why can't there be one country, one vote, Jews, Christians, Muslims, atheists, one state, one vote, right? And that would be a non-Zionist Palestine, right? So Zionism, the ideology of Zionism would be extirpated, right? And that's what basically he was saying. In fact, the Iranian foreign policy, in my view, is actually quite moral. I mean, I interviewed an Iranian professor, a really exceptional guy named Professor Marandi, right, who's a University of Tehran professor in American studies, and he was saying, our position on Israel, he said, it's a complete replica of our position on South Africa. He said, Iran's position on South Africa during the Cold War was, until it ceases to be an apartheid state, we won't recognize it, we won't trade with it, we won't do anything with it. Iran's position on Israel is, until it ceases to be an apartheid state, we won't work with it. Interestingly, Iran has a thriving Jewish community. There's so many documentaries of, they have Jewish members of parliament in Iran. And in fact, it's really annoying the Israelis because they keep trying to bribe the Iranian Jews to go to Israel. And they're saying, we have a perfectly happy life here, thanks very much. We don't want to come.
I have a good friend who's Iranian, and he's told me the same thing many times, that there is and has been for, I think, a very, very, very long time, a very happy and prosperous and thriving Jewish community in Iran, and everything is fine.
And one of the great scholars who he's a young guy, like myself, called Jonathan Azaziah, and he talks about his mother being in Morocco as a Moroccan Jew in the 1950s and how Israel came and did all these false flags, blowing up synagogues and stuff. They did it in Egypt too and in Iraq, to try and get the Jewish community there to feel unsafe. And that had a lot to do with the kind of classism in Israel that emerged, because you had all these white European Jews come to Palestine and they had all these utopian ideas of doing the kibbutz, but they'd actually, when it came down to it, they didn't really want to do the dirty work. So they brought in all these brown-skinned Jews from Morocco and Egypt and Iraq through false flags they did by blowing up the mosques and blaming the synagogues and blaming it on the Muslim Brotherhood and so on. Brought them in to do all the dirty work in Israel, and so there's that kind of caste system in that country that's emerged. But coming back to Iran's foreign policy, their support for the resistance in the south of Lebanon. Israel invaded Lebanon in the 1980s, and in 2006 the Hezbollah were victorious in making Israel recede from 99% of their territory. So Iran stands in solidarity with the Hezbollah. Iran stands in solidarity with Syrian sovereignty. Iran stands in solidarity with the Bahraini protesters who are against the Bahraini dictatorship. And so, actually, if you compare Iran's foreign policy with the foreign policy of, for example, the United States
or Canada,
it's far more moral. I mean, you look at Canada's stance on Israel. I've seen interviews, for example, with John Baird on Qatari state media, Al Jazeera. And he almost looks scared to criticize Israel. Honestly, it looks like there's fear in their eyes. And in fact, there's evidence suggesting that, a lot of... I was listening to Ilan Pappé, that Israeli dissident scholar, on a podcast when I was driving to Vancouver, And he was saying he went to meet with one senator, the one senator who would even entertain this dissident Israeli scholar to come and talk critically about Israel-Palestine. And he said we practically had to meet in the washroom because this senator on Capitol Hill was so scared.
Who was this one senator?
Well, he wouldn't name him. And he said, and, you know, likewise in Britain, right, there's a journalist named Peter Obon, and he was doing all these anti-Islamic documentaries. And someone said to him, why are you always focusing on Muslims? Why don't you do one on Christians or Jews? So he said, okay, I'm going to go and do a documentary on, he called it Inside Britain's Israel Lobby. He went up to the British Parliament, into the parliamentary offices of members, and this is he writes for the mainstream news, right? Peter Obon. Your viewers can just Google Inside Britain's Israel Lobby. He said these members of Parliament said, we're not going to talk to you till we take the batteries out our cell phones. We don't want to talk to you in our office in case it's bugged. And it's pretty much identified now that in the case of Western countries, that the Middle East policies are being decided by pro-Israel lobbyists. And it's something it's a bone that sticks in the throat because it gets us close to anti-Semitic theories, but it's something we have to confront, I think, because I think we're having a shift in imperialism that's going on. And I really don't see why, if British people can, if English people can go into onto the extremes of having imperialism and empire and overzealous capitalism, and French people can have an empire and the Americans had the empire, why we should treat Jewish people as inferior. Jewish people can have an empire too. The Jewish state in the Middle East is, it's an ethnic nationalist, imperialist state. And I believe that the documentary record suggests that that's what's happening in the Middle East, that we're kind of seeing Israel now emerging. It was kind of having its baby steps in the 1950s, 60s, 70s, and now it's emerged into a really strong hegemon in the region. It's attained hegemony. And I think that, increasingly there's people like Ken O'Keefe and Gilad Atzmon. There's an emerging kind of group of activists who are willing to talk about, what might be called Israeli power in terms of US Middle East policy. And I think that, if you look at like what happened in the American Revolution, in the British Parliament, there was all kinds of debates about, what should happen to the Americas, what should happen to the colonies, I think that's the kind of debates, if you get into the scholarship, is happening within the American empire now. Should we side with Iran? There's a school of thought in the American empire that actually they should kind of co-opt Iran and work with Iran, because the Iranian government would, obviously oil companies have a lot of expertise. They could help them develop their oil resources. That's big oil traditionally wanted to kind of cozy up with ensconced regimes, and work with them. And so I think there is this debate that's going on. It's quite an interesting debate intellectually. And I think it's important that people on the left, I often think it's a mistake of people on the left. They never read the right-wing literature from conservative scholars like Pat Buchanan, Stephen Snagosky's he calls himself a paleo-conservative. He was in the Republican Party all his life, because I think as leftists we can get a lot of insights into the factionalism on the right. I mean, you think the right wing and the ruling class are always dividing and ruling us, the working class, right? But if you actually get into those elite, the scholarship from the kind of right of centre elite, you can see what's going on, the fissures, the factionalism in the bourgeoisie, and that way we can do our best to end imperialism and capitalist exploitation.
Joshua, thank you very much. We're almost out of time, but I think both of us want to wrap up by going back to the Vancouver hearings and just, I think, informing people about what that's going to be about.
Yeah, so it's a 9/11 Truth Conference, basically, that's occurring in the Denman Theatre in Vancouver, June 15th to 17th. And the goal is to basically expound the boundaries of 9/11 truth and to not abrogate, certain topics because they might be controversial. As I've suggested in this interview, there are an increasing number of people who think Israel was involved in 9/11. Why shouldn't we talk about that in public? There's people who actually, a great number of people think there was no planes on 9/11. Professor Fetzer has evidence that Flight 77 and Flight 11 weren't even scheduled on 9/11. Rather than saying, oh, that's just on the fringes, that can't be addressed, it's controversial, let's bring it into the center and talk about it. Were there even planes on 9/11? If there was no hijackers and there were no planes, this 9/11 conspiracy actually is more easy to pull off from the perspective of the criminals who pulled it off. Because you think if there were, there are actually no planes to hijack. One thing I really admire about Professor Fetzer, because he's a controversial figure in the 9/11 Truth movement. He founded Scholars for 9/11 Truth, and then a group kind of splintered off and founded Scholars for 9/11 Truth and Justice. One thing I really admire about Professor Fetzer is he kind of brings to the surface like citizen investigators who have gone in, like some people who appear on his radio show, The Real Deal. They've spent years just looking into, well, who were the passengers that allegedly died on these planes? Why didn't they claim any compensation? Who were their family members? Were they military and FBI people? These kind of questions. And one thing I think Professor Fetzer has done is really dignify those who might not have letters after their name, might not be PhDs or physicists. And I think what we saw with the Toronto hearings was maybe a little bit of kind of elitism, where it was, you know, kind of academics who, a lot of academics, they think, oh, they're being really controversial because they might say, or maybe the United States allowed 9/11 to happen, right? But really, when you get into the nitty gritty, the United States did not allow 9/11 to happen. The people within the US government did 9/11, right? And one criticism I had of the Toronto hearings was they didn't negate LIHOP, let it happen on purpose, and prioritize MIHOP, made it happen on purpose. And I would say that if you establish on day one of a conference that bin Laden and Al-Qaeda and Islamists had nothing to do with 9/11, even Al-Qaeda, does it even exist as a coherent and autonomous non-state actor? That's still, you know, unclear, right? I think you just have patsies that are plucked and put in strategic positions here and there for false flag incidents, you know. I think that if we negate those premises from the outset, you know, of Al-Qaeda involvement and so on, we can pursue with who, what, when, why. What actually happened on 9/11? Who did 9/11? We're not going to make generalizations, just get into the, you know, specifics of it. And if we do that, I think we can, you know, bring truth. It can be said that historically that citizens got together, even though the governments weren't willing to respect the law, weren't willing to respect justice and morality, that at least some citizens came together and did a real and genuine and comprehensive investigation, as a court of law would.
Joshua Blakeney, thank you very much. And ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for watching Face to Face.